Hey, friends, that you have had a great first couple of sessions and enjoyed our worship service with the many. What a great opportunity to be with them and to think differently about where we are and where we're going. It's been great to see so many of you so far. A couple of announcements before we get to Christian. There is a trivia night tonight that Carl is hosting that we are excited about. So if you would like to come hang out with us tonight, that will be at 7, I believe, East, 6 Central. And then there's also a poll for on Thursday morning. So if you could weigh in, that would be great for us to know what you would like to hear. Friends, we are grateful to have the support of conference, and Carl is going to launch the video right now.
MTSO is one of 13 seminaries and theological schools affiliated with the United Methodist Church. Our mission is to provide theological education and leadership in pursuit of a just, sustainable, and generative world. Located on nearly 80 acres in Delaware, Ohio, MTSO's campus is located just 30 minutes north of Columbus, the fastest growing large city in the Midwest over the past decade. MTSO offers 6 graduate degrees, including the Master of Divinity and our newest degree program, the Master of Arts in Social Justice. Our faculty members are respected scholars and authors who regularly contribute to international, religious, and academic conferences. They are engaged mentors and advisors to our students both inside and outside of the classroom. MTSO is committed to making the pursuit of theological education affordable, and over half of our students has earned a full tuition scholarship. MTSO's diverse student body represents 15 faith traditions. Students' engagement in the life of the school, both in and outside of the classroom, shapes the identity of the campus even as they prepare for lives of consequence beyond its borders. For more information about MTSO, including Seminary Hill Farm, our 10-acre on-campus sustainable market farm, and our affordable on-campus housing options, email us at admissions@mtso.edu or visit www.mtso.edu.
It is our absolute pleasure this evening to have Christian Coon join us as our plenary speaker. Christian is the co-founder of Urban Village Church, a multi-site United Methodist church in Chicago. In addition to his book, Failing Boldly, boy, do I love that title, he has contributed to and written several books, including his latest, Expanding the Expedition Through Church Partnerships. He lives in the South Loop of Chicago with his wife, Ann, and his children, Caroline and Ethan. He has a BA from Simpson College, an MSJ from Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and an MDiv from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. I actually first met Christian as I was driving to Buffalo. We were on a call, so that was an interesting experience as I ate my Wendy's hamburger. And Christian, I posted or shared something about our event, and good friends of mine who live in Chicago saw it and said that they knew you, that you were the pastor at their church for a while. So welcome. We're glad you were with us, and we can't wait to hear from you as you help us understand how awesome it is to fail boldly. Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Eddie. And it's great to be with all of you here today. One of the many things that we are missing out on by being virtual is those really great lanyards that sometimes you get at conferences. And so I wanted to start here. I got out some of my favorites just in honor of that occasion. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the labels that we give to ourselves. And so if you could, is the PowerPoint running at this time too? There it is. Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you. So some of the labels, I want you to think for a moment, sort of some of the labels that you might give yourself. So some of the ones that I have are father and husband, runner, pastor, planter. I'm a native Iowan. I'm an author and a city dweller. And so what I would love as a way to begin to get to know some of you I'd love it if you would in the chat just put what are 2 or 3 labels that you all give yourselves. It can be a straightforward thing. It can be something that is a little bit funny or unique or creative. So I'm just going to give you a second now. I'm going to watch along. What are some of the labels that you give yourselves in addition to the name instead of the name tags? What are some of the labels that you give yourselves? Dog parent, that's a good one. Another Simpson alum, I love it. Good, well, keep posting those because those are the labels that we give ourselves. Sometimes we give them so that we want people to look at us or know us in a certain way, but we all probably have experienced times when somebody gives a label to us. And sometimes that can be complimentary, sometimes not so much. And so I want to talk a little bit about sometimes what are the labels that someone might give me, whether I want it or not. So before starting Urban Village, I was serving a church in the suburbs, and there was a guy there that I was kind of in conflict with. And so as try as I might, I tried to, we would have good one-on-one conversations, but he would also, this is kind of just in the early days of email, so he preferred to mail me things. And there was one day when he mailed me something. He was not pleased with the leadership that I was showing this particular church. And so one day in the mail, I got something in the mail, and there was a photo. And so if we could pull that up on the PowerPoint, that's the next one. There's this picture. I don't know if you can tell that this is a mother duck. And then as they move along, then these little ducks fall into the grate. And so this guy named Walt had wrote at the bottom of this photo. So he mailed this to me in the mail. Here's the photo. And on the bottom of this photo, he wrote, "This is the leadership at Christ United Methodist Church." So I took that as a sign that I was the mother duck. And that was the label he was giving me, and that I was leading this congregation down the sewer. So all of you are doing a really great job of giving some lovely labels that you give yourselves. Now, I know I'm just starting out here. I don't know you at all, but I'm going to ask us to be a little bit vulnerable. If you wouldn't mind sharing, what's 1 or 2 labels that somebody has given you that you may or may not have asked for? So for me, it is mother duck leading her ducklings into the sewer. That's one label that someone has given to me. How about some others? What are 1 or 2 maybe that you did or did not want for them to give to you? Heretic. Thank you for sharing these. So in many ways, sometimes the labels either that we give ourselves or the label that someone might give to us are because of what we produce or what people can see. And so that becomes our main label, and that kind of subsumes everything else, only by what people see or by what we produce. And so one of the labels, of course, that someone had mentioned was that I'm the co-founder of Urban Village. And I noticed earlier in some of the labels that I saw at least one Enneagram. Others might have been putting some of their own Enneagram, fans of the Enneagram on there too. I am an Enneagram 3. And so achiever is one time, sometimes called threes, sometimes performers. But this is one description that I read of an Enneagram 3. Success-oriented, image-conscious, and wired for productivity. They are motivated by a need to be or appear to be successful and to avoid failure. And so take that into consideration. I want to show folks a little bit or a quick video that gives you an idea of what Urban Village is. So Urban Village. So this is about 12 years ago. And one of the reasons I show this is because I have a little bit more hair in this video. So if you could go ahead and show this video.
When you put out there that you're starting a church where everyone is welcome, absolutely accepted where they are, I mean, I think that news gets out.
Being part of that very inclusive and accepting environment is probably one of the best feelings ever.
This is not the place that we say you need to be this way. God loves you and Jesus loves you as you are.
That's a really pretty compelling place to be in a community where you don't have to make those commitments at the outset, where you can just really come with your questions, with your sense of wonder.
I have 2 children and I'm looking forward to a church experience that works for them.
I really feel blessed that I finally felt like I found a home.
We started last July with Trey and I and our families, so we were under 10 people, and we had this vision for what this church could become. And it was all on paper, and we got really excited about the kind of church that we wanted to build. Right now we have 2 or 3 small groups that are meeting on an ongoing basis, Bible studies. We have an LGBT group that is meeting regularly.
We do music from jazz to contemporary to old hymns to gospel to YouTube.
So far, we have volunteered at places like the Greater Chicago Food Depository and the Night Ministry.
There are tons of ways of following Jesus. And that can be frustrating for some religious people who want to say, this is what following Jesus looks like. Well, maybe that's one way of what following Jesus looks like, but there are different ways to follow.
What we are trying to do is be a church for all people, no matter what denomination they may have come from, no matter what belief they may have, but we're doing it in a way that is distinctly United Methodist.
It is a space that challenges you a little and stretches you a little and shows you different people thinking and talking and worshiping God differently. And that's a good thing.
I've met people that I think hold really different beliefs than I do, and yet who've given me pause and made me think, and that's really exciting. That feels challenging to me.
The sermons are relevant, and that's not something that I had necessarily had experience with in the past.
Jesus was one who welcomed all to the table.
You don't have to be anything besides who you are at this church.
It's a fun place to be.
Faith does actually make a difference in the way you live, in the way you experience the world, in the way you love and allow yourself to be loved.
It's probably not a coincidence that you're listening to this message right now. So come and see. What could it hurt?
I was fortunate to have a brother-in-law who is a video expert. And so he is the one who kind of put this video together. And when we first saw it, and they did all the interviews and everything else, and Trey Hall is the other co-founder of Urban Village. And when I saw this, the 3 in me, the one who likes to be success-oriented and image-conscious, I was eating all of this up. And that kind of started me on the path, somewhat dangerous path. And it goes a little bit into what church planting is about too, because there is such a strong focus on production, on numbers. I don't know what it is in various campus ministries, but my hunch is that is true for all of you. How many students are you engaging with? How much money are you raising? All of these different things. And so I think when we begin to label ourselves by what we produce or how we look, that can begin to send us into a place where if we are not measuring up, if those are not measuring up, that can get us into a challenging spiritual place. So we, as I mentioned, or was mentioned, Urban Village is a multi-site congregation. And so we launched our first worship back in March of 2000. And we launched new sites pretty quickly, and we were pretty aggressive about that. And so within the first 3 years of Urban Village, we were worshiping in 4 locations throughout Chicago. And when we were doing that, we made a decision at some point that each of the pastors would be located at one of the different locations. So my location was the very first one in the South Loop neighborhood of Chicago. And what was happening when I went to that first, because at first I thought, oh, this is the mothership. But then I quickly discovered that that wasn't probably necessarily going to be the best of the sites. And so we were getting to a place where 2 of our other sites in the Wicker Park and Andersonville neighborhoods were doing really well. So Trey, the other co-founder, was at one of those. He was at the Wicker Park site, and he really turned that site around. And Brittany, she was our pastor of our north side, Andersonville site, was doing that too. And again, I had this mindset of, I am measuring myself. The label I am giving myself is how successful I am numerically. And that's how I was judging and comparing myself. I'm going to talk about comparing a little bit later. I was comparing myself to how these other sites were doing. So for a while in our staff meetings, we would come together on Tuesdays and we would talk about how did the last Sunday go. And so then everyone would kind of share attendance numbers. Now, the Andersonville, Brittany site, and the Wicker Park site, Trey site, those were both doing really well and increasing. My site was beginning to tank. And so I found myself in a really hard place. And I even got to the point where I was secretly hoping that some of these other sites would have bad Sundays so that I would look better. Now, that's not a great attitude to have for the health of the whole church, but that's where I was, because the label I was giving myself was, I'm a church planter, and therefore I am judging myself by what I am producing. I am judging myself by how many people are showing up, how many lives are transformed, and so on. And so I can't imagine, that's how it is for the life of church. I can't imagine for campus ministers and the roller coaster that all of you must go through, especially in the last 18 months or so, when you are so focused on wanting to make sure you're getting a certain number of students in the door or out as you're meeting with people, and the money that you might have to raise too. And so that sent me off to a place where I had to take a sabbatical. And that's when I first started to go to therapy. And that's when I really started to ramp up my spiritual direction, because I realized if I was only measuring myself by that label of what I was producing, then I was going to be in deep trouble. In other words, I was forgetting my primary label. And I talk about this in the first chapter of my book. And the reason I put it at the very beginning of the book is when I talk about failure with folks, especially as we think about if we fail and don't produce what we want, or we don't get the results we want, and if that's our primary label by what we are exhibiting to others, I think it's going to be a short time in ministry for all of us. And so the first chapter in my book that I talk about is that belovedness needs to be our home station. That our main label, and this now I'm at slide 9. Our main label needs to be that we are a beloved child of God. And so this is from a baptism that we did on Lake Michigan. And I'm sure you all know the passage from Luke 3, when all the people were baptized, when Jesus had also been baptized and was praying, heaven was open and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice from heaven saying, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And that whole sense of being beloved, you would think, I'd been in the ministry for almost 20 years. When I got to that really hard place, you would think that that would have sunk in, that I am beloved, that is my main label. But I had forgotten that. Even though even though we talked about it a lot at church, I had forgotten that. And so I needed to get away in order to remind myself, no matter what I produce, no matter what the results are, that has to be my main label. Beloved child of God has to be my main label before anything else. Gregory Boyle is a Catholic priest, Homeboy Ministries, author of several books, and he writes that you are my beloved, in whom I am wonderfully pleased. This is all God wants to say. And I love the way he phrases it, that this is God's singular agenda item. In order for this message across, that you are my beloved, in whom I am wonderfully pleased. Now, what I am saying to you today, of course, is not necessarily radical news. This is something that I know all of you probably tell some of your students, and maybe you know it in your better days too. But I do think that, at least speaking from personal experience, is something that I forget. And I begin to label myself and judge myself by in other ways too. And I use the example for some, if you've ever seen the movie Good Will Hunting, and there is a scene in the movie when Will is there with the psychiatrist, Robin Williams. The character's name is Sean McGuire. And it has come to light that Will has been abused as a child. And Sean, the psychiatrist, has seen the report. And he turns to Will and he holds up the report and he says, "It's not your fault," as he's holding up this report. And then Will says, yeah, I know. And Sean says, "It's not your fault." And Will says, "Yeah, I know." And Sean says again, "It's not your fault." And there gets this emotional roller coaster for Will, where at first he gets defensive and then angry. And Sean says, "It's not your fault" 9 times in order before Will finally breaks down in tears and hugs Sean for all that he's worth. And I think about that scene because that basic precept that we are beloved children of God is something that I think so many of us in ministry forget, because we judge ourselves by what we produce or how we want others to see us, or we put that label that we listed earlier as at the forefront. Now, all of these things are part of who we are, but if we forget the main part, the main label that you and I have as beloved children of God, I think that makes our own ministries really challenging. And I think in order for us to really sink into that, to make sure that we are truly beloved, then that allows us to be able to try new things and to risk things in ministry, which is going to be even more important as we head into this new. Father Boyle was talking about in the speech that I heard him talk when he gave that phrase about being wonderfully pleased. That's the main thing that God wants to get across to us. And he was sharing a story about being with his mother on her deathbed. And all of the family was gathered there together. And she was so ready. Father Boyle said that she was ready to die. And that as they were gathered together and they thought that this might be the last, he said that his mother woke up at one point, might be with God, that she might be in heaven. And she saw all of her children there gathered together. And she looked kind of disturbed, a little angry. And she said, crying out loud. And Father Boyle said that she was pissed that she wasn't dead. But finally, at some point when she opened up a second time and she saw who was gathered around her, and she exclaimed to all of her children, and she said, "You're here. You're here." And that, I think, is when we present ourselves to God as beloved children, this is what we hear and this is what we take in when we notice that God says to us, "You're here," every day that we wake up. "My beloved child, you're here." And that is the thing, that is the main label that I hope all of us can remember. And before I talk about, I'm going to talk about how to introduce failure into your ministry and how to respond, how to bounce back from failure. But I always start with this component to remember our belovedness, because that is the thing that we have to have the foundation of who we are as pastors, as ministers, as campus pastors. That's what we have to do in order to truly take risks, and go into the really challenging field of campus ministry. So before I talk about introducing failure, how to introduce failure into all of your ministries, any reflections at all or questions about anything like that? Again, I know this is not big or radical news, but I hope that it's something that it's the kind of thing that sometimes we have to say several times in order for it to truly sink in. If not, then I am more than ready to kind of talk about our next section. And this is about how we can introduce failure into our ministries. And so now I'm at slide 12. So this is when I wrote this book, not realizing, of course, that talking about vaccinations would be something that would be a huge and hot topic and very timely now. But in the book, I write and introduce people to Edward Jenner. Some of you may or may not know who Edward Jenner is, but he's kind of known as really one of the founders of vaccinations. He was a scientist and a surgeon in Great Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century. And when he lived, cowpox was a relatively harmless disease that folks contracted when coming into contact with, of course, cows. And so it was harmless, but the story goes that a local milkmaid told Dr. Jenner that something remarkable happened, that whenever someone had cowpox, they never contracted smallpox, which was just a much more serious and deadly disease. And so Dr. Jenner must have filed this away in his mind. And later he treated another woman, another dairymaid, who had contracted cowpox. And he saw this as an opportunity to test the theory that cowpox carriers were immune to smallpox viruses. And so today we would be a little bit appalled by the methods that he used, but he took a little boy, and this is the rendering here that you're seeing in front of you. He took a little boy who was the son of the gardener, his gardener. He made some scratches on the boy's arm, and he rubbed material from the pox of somebody else's hand who had cowpox and into this boy. And then the boy did get cowpox. And then later on, he did the same thing, and he put the smallpox vaccine into this boy. So again, it's kind of awful the way that he did that. But this is the beginning of what we know of today as variolation or vaccines. And so I thought about this as a way, perhaps sometime, that ministries need to, in a sense, kind of inoculate themselves with small failures, taking small risks in order to withstand and resist bigger failures that may come down the line, like like the shutting down of a ministry or something as drastic as that. And kind of my premise for us to think about what are small ways that our ministries can fail in order to thrive in their ministry. So there are a few things that I think are helpful for us to do that. And the first thing, and this is slide 13, that I wanted to lift up, and then I don't know if any of you know Rich Havard here ministry. I use this mainly as a way to show Rich. But one of the first things that we try to do at Urban Village is to pray for courageous hearts. Now, again, I know this is probably up there with remembering that you are a beloved child of God is not necessarily big news, but I find in ministry anyway, that a lot of people talk about prayer and they say, yeah, we should do that. We should probably pray. But I don't know if people really take it seriously. At the very beginning of Urban Village, we were very intentional about trying to make sure that we had a team of people who were really praying for us. And so I would invite you to really think about who are people as you start back up in the fall that you can recruit and being intentional about praying for you. There's a quote, this is slide 14. This is author Sue Nielsen Kibbe in the book called Floodgates. And she talks about, is your church snacking on or feasting on prayer? And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to remember. I'm curious too, as you begin to, I'd love to, maybe others would too, what are some creative prayer practices that your ministries have engaged in? We've done, prayer walks and have prayer partners, things like that. But I would also love if folks could share what are some creative prayer practices that you've done in your own ministries as a way to engage. And so praying for courageous hearts has got to be the first thing that churches or that ministries can do. The second thing is to think different. This is slide 15. And so I'm stealing a little bit from Steve Jobs of the Apple campaign that happened several years ago. But again, it's important, and I read his biography, and sometimes when this campaign first came out, a lot of people said, well, it should be think differently, not think different. But Jobs is saying, no, it has to be think different, meaning you need to think like thinking big, think curious, think beauty, think different. Because I think so often in ministries, and I know this happens in the church world, that sometimes churches will try to simply improve slightly rather than create new things. And so what we try to do at Urban Village is to try to get people to think about not just incremental improvement, what are small ways that we can engage in the people in our communities, but also what are new, creative, powerful, risk-taking ways that we can engage with the people who are around us. So this is one example in slide 16. And so this picture is of Juan Pablo Herrera. He works at Urban Village, started off as a layperson at our church, and now is on staff. And he got interested in a gay line dancing group. And so Juan Pablo had kind of lived closeted for a lot of his life. And it was at Urban Village that he was finally able to truly come out. And one of the things that he did was to engage in this line dancing dance for gay men, a line dancing group for gay men. And so Juan Pablo started to get engaged with this and meet some of the guys. And they started to learn that he was part of a church, which some of them thought was kind of curious. And so before they would do their performances, they remembered that they saw some of the videos or documentaries of Madonna. And Madonna, before she would go on stage, she would gather with her dancers and they would pray. And so one of the line dancers said to Juan Pablo, can we do like Madonna does? And so Juan Pablo began to pray with this group. And so this is the beginning of a little ministry that we didn't necessarily plan or anything, but I think this is an example, a really wonderful example of what it means to think different. I don't know if I would have necessarily thought we've got to reach the gay line dancers, but that was a group that was really important to Juan Pablo, and it became a real opportunity for us as well to engage in that way. So after praying and beginning to really think different, and it's important too, as we come back to think of new and creative ways that we can get out there. The third thing, this is slide 17, that I would encourage you to think about is to set what I call failure goals. Now, there was a study that I discovered and found out about they were measuring cab drivers in New York City. And these cab drivers had a certain quota of the amount of rides that they had to have per day. But one thing that they realized was that on rainy days, they would meet that quota really early in the day, and then they would just take the rest of the day off. And so they use this as a way to talk about sometimes goals can have somewhat of a harmful effect. And I'm quoting from the study that says sometimes goals can get us to such a narrow focus that neglects non-goal areas, a rise in unethical behavior, distorted risk preferences, and corrosion of organizational culture. So I'm not saying that goals are bad necessarily, but I would encourage folks to talk or think about what are ways that we can think about taking these risks, thinking different, and what would it look like for you to tell your board or your leadership team, how many times can we try something that is just not going to work this year? And so we're going to fail 3 times. And I think by setting that bar, in a sense, at the beginning of the school year to tell folks we plan on failing this number of times, I think may free some other people in order for them to realize and not feel the weight of if this event or this outreach or whatever doesn't quite work, it might alleviate some of that pressure from them. And then when you do so, to be public about that and to let people know when things don't work out. So one of the organizations that I'm really impressed with is an organization called Engineers Without Borders. And so this is slide 18. And so this is on their annual report. And so in Engineers Without Borders, which is similar to Doctors Without Borders, Engineers Without Borders puts this they put the things that they fail at in their annual report. And so a quote as to why they do that says this. It says, Engineers Without Borders believes that success in development is not possible without taking risks and innovating, which inevitably means failing sometimes. We also believe it's important to publicly celebrate these failures, which allows us to share the lessons more broadly and create a culture that encourages creativity and calculated risk-taking. This is a culture we value within Engineers Without Borders. What would it look like for your board this year for you to say, we're going to try 3 things this year that are not going to work out, because that is the only way that we feel like our ministry is going to thrive. And then when we're public about it, not only do it may alleviate the pressure from your leaders, but I think in sharing it perhaps with some of your other colleagues and your peers in campus ministry, that also may give them the freedom to do just that. In my research on failure, I came across an organization that's kind of the anti-TED Talk. So I think all of you probably are familiar with TED Talks, where the person comes on the stage for 20 minutes. There's always a really impressive slideshow. They've got it down to a T. There's an organization that started in South America. Now it's throughout the world. And my apologies for those who may not be thrilled with swearing, but the organization is called the Fuck Up Nights. And so for those folks, the premise is you come on stage and you have 10 minutes and 7 slides, and you have to talk about the biggest fuck up that you've had recently in your business. So this is mainly around the corporate world. This is one of the things I keep thinking that could be an amazing evangelism opportunity. What would it look like at your campuses to sponsor a fuck up night, especially if your campus is one where there's intense pressure and all of your students are feeling that, to give them the permission to talk about these things publicly and to help them to see that this is a way that we can do that. I'm wondering if anybody is willing and vulnerable enough. I realized beforehand that you're not able to vocalize anything, but I'm going to keep on talking. But if someone would be willing to share a failure in the chat to kind of kick this off a little bit, what is something that you've tried, maybe either during the pandemic or before the pandemic, that didn't turn out the way that you had hoped? And maybe this is a way that people can realize I'm not alone in knowing that all the things that I attempt, or the unique thing that I want to try, I'm not alone when those things don't pan out. So I'll keep talking, and if I would encourage you to share something in the chat, I think that would be helpful for all of us. It goes into a little bit too, and now I'm on slide 19, and this is the important key next step too, is setting failure goals, but also that we have to be lighthearted about it, and we can't take ourselves too seriously in the midst of this. And so one of my favorite examples of this is what Ben & Jerry's does. And so this is on their website. Well, actually, I toured the Ben & Jerry's factory in Vermont a few years ago. And as we were walking around, I noticed that there was this little graveyard. And so you can see a picture of it here. And what Ben & Jerry's has done, this is also virtual. You can look this up online. So Ben & Jerry's will try different flavors, and the ones that don't work for whatever reason, they put this, or they have a little funeral for these flavors in order, again, to kind of publicize that things are not always going to work out, and to be a little bit, to give some levity to what they're all about, recognizing. I forgot to write down, I'd have to look through my book, to some of the examples of some of the flavors that didn't make the cut. But you can, like I said, you can search for Ben & Jerry's, and you can see not only are the flavors, but they write little epitaphs and do little funerals for these flavors. And so I love that they realize that it's lighthearted, and we realize not everything we try is going to work out. And so to have a moment when they're able to laugh about it, hoping that they're also learning from it. And that leads me to the next slide. So this is slide 20. What we have tried to do at Urban Village is, at the very beginning, is use some of the tools for community organizing. And so part of community organizing, as we've learned it anyway, is to always do, sometimes call an autopsy, or do a review of what you have done, especially if it didn't work out, and to see what happened, or what went well, what didn't well, and so on. So it's one thing, of course, to think different and to try new things. and she might laugh about it and so on. But then if you just move on to the next thing without looking back, okay, what didn't go well here? Was it the wrong time of the day? Did we not try to target the right audience? What was it? And do you know what it was that didn't quite work out? So let me give you an example. So we tried at Urban Village, we thought a great idea to take coffee, like partner with a local coffee shop and to hand out coffee at in the South Loop. So one of the busy train stations near where I live. And so we were going to try to literally give coffee away to people. And we had the little coffee warmers on the cups with the Urban Village stamp on those little sleeves. And so I thought, this is going to be amazing. And we may have to order so much coffee because people are going to be taking this coffee, and it's going to be awesome. Cold early spring morning, we went out to the or out to the train stop, and we couldn't give this coffee away. We had so much coffee left over, and I could not figure out what it was. And so, actually, you know what? I told the story wrong. I failed in my illustration. What we did first was we stood in front of apartment buildings and condo buildings and tried to give this coffee away, and we weren't successful in doing so. We also did it on a Friday morning as well. And so we did a review of this event and realized a couple things. One, people walking out of the apartment buildings are usually on their way to work and they don't want to stop. And two, we did this on a Friday, and that sometimes if people are going to work from home, again, this is pre-pandemic, but if people are going to work from home, Friday's a day that they're going to do that. And so the traffic isn't as great. And so we took this, did a review, and then we tried it again. This time we didn't go to any of the condo buildings or apartment buildings. Instead, went right to the train station, and we put up one of the Urban Village signs. And we did it the second time. We ran out of coffee in about 20 minutes. And so it was a really good lesson for us to realize, okay, so not everything is going to work out, but it's important to reflect and think about, all right, what is it that didn't work? And so what can we improve? What can we tweak in order to try it again? And sometimes you may realize, like, whatever it is that we tried is just a bad idea altogether. And so it may be untweakable. And so you may have to do something completely different, but it is important to review it. And so again, this is slide 22. Again, here are the steps I think it's important to do in order to make sure that you're doing these things. One is to make sure that you're praying with courageous hearts. Make sure that you are doing all you can to think different, to begin to set failure goals and to let your leaders know we're going to experiment this year and not everything is going too well. So what would it look like if we failed, say 3 times, 4 times, 5 times? To have some levity about it, to make sure it's not the end of the world as some things fall on their faces. And then finally, to do a review. What worked, what didn't work, to make sure that you're learning. And then again, you may realize, like, whatever it was, it's not worth doing at all and just trying something completely different. I also want to name in these kind of how to integrate failure into your ministries. I do want to name one thing too. And that is, I've talked about my book in various contexts. And sometimes it's been brought to my attention that in some ways I am privileged in order to talk about failing. I'm a middle-aged, straight, white guy. And so sometimes I have more leeway to fail, perhaps, than somebody who's a person of color, who identifies as queer, who is a woman. So I also want to name that, to be able to, so when I don't want folks I want folks to know that I throughout my ministry, I perhaps have had more of a runway for failure than others have. But I do hope that some of the things that we talk about can be applicable to you in your own context. I wish I've been kind of going along, and it looks like people are sharing some of their failures, which I really appreciate. So I'm going to pause here before we go into our last little section. Are there any questions at all that folks have about anything?
There's been lots of really good examples of failing boldly. You scroll up. Thank you, friends, for sharing that information. I haven't seen any specific questions yet, but if you have other failures, we love to hear about them. They're very helpful for all of us. We can learn from us.
Totally. There are, whenever I kind of talk about these kind of failures and things that did Urban Village, there's a palpable relief in the room that people kind of realize that they're not alone. And so that's one of the benefits.
So why don't we finish up and just kind of talk about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question for you. What would you would look like with a bunch of college students? Would it be like we sit around and share what we've screwed up this week or this semester? How would that what would that look like, do you think?
I think it probably depends on the context. It could take any number of iterations, but I think especially if you are working with kind of high productivity, intense students, you could creative so that what would it look like for them to kind of create their own, again, using TED Talk as an anti-model, what would it look for them to create 5 PowerPoint slides and to kind of really walk through the steps of, here's where I fucked up. Here are the 5 things I did that led to that. On one hand, you can make it, especially if you're dealing with people who are really high achieving students, but you could also do it in a much more casual way too, to let we're going to be doing this, and then ask people to be open and honest. And I think one thing that could work too is that you could, and then say, go to the business school or go to another section of camp. It doesn't necessarily have to be with your ministry students. It could, but I really think that it could be an evangelism event, so that you could be the sponsor of it, but you're opening it up to anybody for them to talk about anything. And I think that could be a really helpful way. Again, because from some of the reading that I've done, I have a daughter who's going to be a junior at Michigan State. And so son who's going to be a junior in high school. So I know that whole sense of so many students are suffering from imposter syndrome and they feel like I don't belong. Everybody else is doing so much better than me. And so for them to have a space, whether it's in a quote unquote Christian context or not, I think it'd be really interesting. All right. So one thing that I want to end with is also, some people have kind of mentioned this to me, that in some way talking about failure has become fashionable. There's also a book called Failing Forward, and so sometimes high achieving people will talk about, you've got to fail in order to succeed and all of that kind of stuff. So one thing I try to emphasize too is that we have to name, and we can be lighthearted, we can make jokes about it, all this kind of stuff, but we also have to name that failing really sucks and it really hurts. And so I also want to name that. And so what I also try to talk to folks are, what are some things, what gets in the way so that we can try to come back from failure. And so here are some things that I have found over the years that have been helpful for me in order to kind of move from, that initial, when you only have, I joke the very first event we had at Urban Village, we were at a Barnes & Noble in the heart of Chicago, and we had put stuff up on meetup.com. And we thought for sure, like, there's going to be at least 50 people who show up for this thing because this idea we have is awesome and everybody's going to be a part of it. And one person showed up that night. And I thought, this church is going to tank even before we start worshiping. And so, and that, like, I couldn't sleep that. And so failing was not fun, but some things that over the years have been helpful for me. And so this, on slide 24, I've touched on this a little bit. But this is a picture of, so this is me and this is Trey. So Trey, again, is the other co-founder of Urban Village. And so some people have talked about us, and I shared this particular picture because sometimes when people have met us and they'll want to label us, they'll say, oh, the introvert. He's the more quiet, reserved one, and Trey is the extrovert. And in some ways, that is true. I mean, Trey hit like 5,000 friends on Facebook, like so early on in the game. And when you think about someone who's charismatic and engages really easily, you think Trey. Now, hopefully I'm not like a bump on the log, but sometimes I'm not quite as engaging. And I do skew a little bit more toward introversion than Trey does. And so this is a picture of me trying to be Trey. So Trey has since moved to England. And so this is my attempt at being a fan of English football. But I think one of the most challenging things when we think about failing is to think about comparison. And I don't know I can only speak about for myself and my own ministry. And I talked about this earlier when my site at the South Loop, when our numbers were declining, and some of the other sites and their numbers are doing great. And I would look at Trey and I would think internally, Trey's just a much better pastor than I am. He's bringing in the people. People love him more than I am. I should probably just quit the ministry because that would be better for everybody involved. Somebody else in order for them to bring in the numbers like Trey did. But I think in talking to other pastors, especially, the dangers of comparing to somebody else are real. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I have gone to so many different church conferences over the years, and I don't for campus pastors too. And you hear someone talk about their own ministry, and they have these amazing like Lazarus types. I went to campus and there were 3 people there. And by the end of the school year, it's amazing. And one of the workshop leaders at the Summer Institute is Tyler Sitt. Tyler just wrote a book, and he talks about sometimes at these these presenters, they're the ones with the shiny shoes and the straight teeth. And so whenever I have gone to conferences like this, I would walk away from the conferences feeling deflated. I mean, they're supposed to be inspiring, but instead I would walk away feeling depressed because I think, I'm working my ass off trying to do this, and I'm not raking in the people like that person who's presenting was. And so I think it's important for us to name and notice within ourselves when we get into that point of comparing ourselves to somebody else. It can be another campus ministry that you see their Wesley Foundation is doing amazing, and you might think to yourself, mine isn't. And so that's hard when you begin to compare yourself and then even compete when you find yourself competing with somebody with other things too. So I would say, and this goes back to the very first thing about remembering that you are beloved, the main thing. So just be aware of comparing yourself to somebody else and even competing with somebody else. So the second thing to be aware of too, or this thing to do to come back from failure is to get curious. And this is slide 25. And so this is actually, if you go to slide 26, I'm going to quote the always. It's not a presentation if you don't quote Brene Brown. And so in her book Rising Strong, she talks about it takes courage to be curious because it means that we have to explore parts of ourselves that we'd rather gloss over or ignore altogether. This gets back to what I was saying earlier about doing some reflection and doing a review or an autopsy, whatever metaphor you want to use, and thinking about what is it that I did or how I'm feeling in order that this did not go well. And that's to get curious. And that also means to have get honest with yourself too about what your motives were for doing something. So here's a story that I share about when I got curious with myself. This is slide 27. So again, before Urban Village, I served in a suburban church in the Chicago area. And this was around All Saints Day. And I thought I had recently officiated a funeral, and outside at the grave site, the family had hired a band in order to play Amazing Grace. And it was such a powerful moment at this funeral. And so I thought, what would it look like to bring into our church during All Saints Day. And this is before, some of you may be old enough to remember the Yellow Pages. There was literally a section in the Yellow Pages that said bagpipers. So I called up the bagpiper and I hired them on the spot. And I was so proud of myself, how creative I was in ministry. And so All Saints Day shows up or happens, and the bagpiper shows up, and the sanctuary worshiping in, it wasn't huge. And so the bagpiper looked at me and she said, are you sure about this? Because bagpipes get really loud. I like not listening to her because I was thinking about what's going to happen after worship, and people, when after worship and they say nice sermon, they are just going to be singing my praises because of this creative thing that I've added to this worship. So the bagpiper was going to come in at the very end, and the day we were going to list the names of those who have passed on before us in the previous year, and the bagpiper starts walking down the aisle. Bagpiping in a small sanctuary is so loud. It is so loud. And so as the bagpiper is walking down the aisle, I mean, people are literally putting their hands over their ears. I mean, it's already an emotional service anyway. People are beginning to cry. And one little girl looked up to her mother, and I could read her lips, and she said, "Mommy, make it stop." And so as the bagpiper made her way to the very, like thinking to myself, oh God, what have I done? And so I quickly, we fixed it so that the bagpiper would play from way down the hall later on in the service. But at the end of that whole thing, I got curious with myself, and I was honest with myself. Why did I do that? Why did I bring the bagpiper into the service? And I had to, when I was like truly honest with myself, I realized I was not as concerned necessarily about making this a great service. I mean, I want it to be a great service, but I was also, there was a part of me that's like, people are going to think I'm a pretty creative pastor in order for this to happen. And so I wasn't really listening to what others were saying. And so I had to kind of, in a sense, repent and what my motives were in order to truly get curious about that fail in ministry. And so I think that's an important part of how we come back, get curious about ourselves. The next thing, and this is slide 28, is, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and people are beginning to do this about sharing their vulnerability. I think that's so important, especially as we are in connection with other pastors and other campus ministers, in order to talk about what it means to try something and to fail. In my book, I interviewed a pastor in North Carolina named George Linney, and he has had a really interesting ministry where they would set up spots along the Tobacco Trail. This is around the Durham area, and they would small groups along the path as people were exercising and running, and have little worship services there. And so I got on the phone with George, and like right out of the box, he is sharing his vulnerability and talking about his failures. So in slide 29, like right out of the, I have the most famous 10-member church in the world. He said, we're crushing it, and we're the greatest failure in the ministry of the church. And I didn't know him at all. And he just kept talking about this. And he said, things like sharing the gospel means having the courage to be misunderstood. He said, once you get messy, get messier. If our church ended tomorrow, God would say that was a great thing. And he said, he brags about being like 60 sites, and all of these sites have like 6 people. And he said, why should mega churches get that title, location with like thousands of people? He said, we have a mega church because we have all these different locations along the Tobacco Trail with 2, 3, 4, 10 people and all of these different locations. And I got off of this interview with him, and I felt so good, because here was somebody who was truly honest about what it meant to try and to be in ministry. And so if you have the courage and the vulnerability, after you have kind of thought about, am I myself to somebody else, what does it mean? I'm getting curious about what it means. And then to be able to share your vulnerability, because that helps so many other people and it also begins to help others, and I think it helps you too. So I encourage you to share that vulnerability. The next thing, and this is probably a no-brainer, but one tweak I want to make to it, this is slide 30, is to find companions for yourself along. Certainly, of course, to find those trusted friends, to find a spiritual director, find a therapist, whatever it is that you can do that. But one thing that I would add to this too is not only those that you can share with, and trusted colleagues and friends to share when you are struggling, but also I'm a big believer in the great cloud of witnesses. And so I have been helped immensely by those who have gone before, and when they have shared failures and their struggles too. So here's a picture of good old John Wesley, who was pretty open and honest with some of the ways that many of you may know about his failed ministry to Georgia, and in his journal. And I was so grateful for the ways that he would share his failures in that way. So when he would say, for example, I have a fair, I don't know if you can read this kind of small print, I have a fair summer religion. I talk well, nay, and believe myself. Well, no danger is near, but let death look me in the face and my spirit is troubled. And so there would be lots of this kind of sharing in his own journal, which I found really helpful, that, John Wesley is kind of sharing this. And another popular one that part of my cloud of witnesses, part of my companion list, is Henry Nouwen, another, I know, a favorite of so many. And so this is from one of his journals. This is September 3rd, 1995. So many of you know, of course, what a giant Henry Nouwen is. So this is what he wrote near the end of his life. He said, so what about my life of prayer? Do I like to pray? Do I want to pray? Do I spend time praying? Frankly, the answer is no to all three questions. After 63 years of life and 38 years of priesthood, my prayer seems dead as a rock. The truth is that I do not feel much of anything when I pray. And so, I mean, on the one hand, my heart breaks for him, but also I find these testimonies of sorts helpful, again, to remember I'm not alone. And so to find companions, again, close friends and colleagues you have now, but also if you have who are part of your cloud of witnesses, maybe that you have read they've had in the past, and I think that can be hugely helpful. I've never read Nouwen's the Genesee Diaries, and man, he struggles so much. Which again, it's that combination of feeling awful for him, but also like I'm not alone in some of these feelings that I figured I'm the only one who's having these thoughts. And so, in the chat, if someone comes to mind for you, who's been part of your cloud of witnesses, your companion to help you through those moments, feel like you are unable to go on and unable to keep on moving, feel free to share that so that others can know people who they might have in their own cloud of witness and help them along the way. So finally, the last thing in order to kind of come back from failure, and that is to keep dancing. And I want to read an excerpt, and this is slide 31. I want to read an excerpt to close out my time with you today. I want an excerpt from my book. So this picture is of Evan and Tara, and they are members at Urban Village. And so I want to read this to give you a sense of why I'm talking about Evan and Tara here today. The ability to persevere also means that you're awake to more opportunities to risk and fail, and those opportunities come up in lots of different ways. I have found that one of the biggest differences between pastoring a new church and established churches is that I do a lot more weddings than funerals. I'm coming up on 7 years at Urban Village, and I've only done one funeral. There have been several weddings, and I enjoy them. One of my most memorable and fun weddings was for a couple, Evan and Tara, whose church literally days before Evan popped the question. I was pleased and honored to officiate the ceremony in Dallas, which is Tara's hometown. The memory of officiating this wedding will stay with me for numerous reasons, one of them being that it was an education in doing ministry in a cross-racial context. Evan and Tara are American, and I've greatly appreciated the opportunity to have open and honest conversation with them about being Black and successful in worlds like work and school where they are in the minority and sometimes feel the unspoken pressure to code switch, to act in white-created cultures in ways that may not be completely natural for them. They're never false to their own senses of who they are, but in small, subtle ways, they're aware of things they do in order to work and live in contexts slightly different from their own. One of our core areas of ministry at Urban Village is to be what we call a church without walls, specifically a church that is not just culturally and ethnically diverse, but one that has started down the challenging but necessary journey of being anti-racist. Part of this process, of course, means that we read stories and studies of what it means to be anti-racist. Because of this exploration and education, I have just started to get a sense of white privilege and the culturally innate advantages we have and the culturally innate disadvantages that people of color have. Here's the thing, though. I can read about it. I can have conversations with people of color about it, but I'll know what it feels like. My experience of being part of this wedding, though, gave me a very small inkling of what it means and how awkward it feels to function in a context that's culturally different. During Tara and Evan's wedding ceremony, as I stood in front of the wedding guests and read through the liturgy, I would have been culturally blind if I hadn't noticed that the good majority of guests at the ceremony were Black. I didn't feel awkward about this because, though there were some slight differences in the ceremony compared to other weddings I officiated where the guests were nearly, totally completely white, we used the typical United Methodist liturgy, and the flow and rhythm of the ceremony was familiar. At the reception, however, I started noticing a change in emotions. I wasn't uncomfortable per se, but I was cognizant of the fact that I was in an unfamiliar context. I didn't look like most of the people gathered there. The music was different from what I was used to, and I can't think of any other way to say it. The cultural exchanges like greetings and handshakes were a little unfamiliar to me too. I feel a little sheepish writing all this, but I think my experience begins to get at what people of color might feel in settings where the cultural norms are slightly different from their norms. By no means am I saying that I now know what people of color feel like in our society, but I did pay attention to my internal insecurities. Even though everyone I talked to made me feel very comfortable and welcome, I was a little nervous about saying or doing the wrong thing. In other words, I didn't want to be a cultural failure. The best way I knew how to do that was to stay as hidden and inconspicuous as possible. I enjoyed pleasant conversation with the other guests at my table, and while I was enjoying the celebration, I planned to make an exit as soon as they cut the cake, which also meant that I would not be venturing out on the dance floor. The fact that I would skip the dancing is a little unusual for me. I like to dance at weddings, and though I wouldn't say I'm a great dancer, I'd like to think I don't embarrass myself, though my children would disagree with that. But if my plan was to be inconspicuous, well, let's just say that getting out on the dance floor would work against that plan. In my mind, I'd simply shine a spotlight on what would surely be a massive fail. Hey, everyone, come look at the 47-year-old white guy try to dance. The music was new to me, and I noticed that everyone on the dance floor moved effortlessly to the beat and in rhythm with everyone around them. As I was eyeing the exits then, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that Evan's mom was trying to get my attention. She has a gregariousness that is infectious. It's impossible not to feel good about yourself and the world after having a conversation with her. But she was making a request that I was not, except she had come off the dance floor and was entreating me to come out and dance with her. Clearly, she did not know my plan for a quiet exit and my attempt to stay hidden. Or maybe she did. No matter what her motives were, she would not be denied and pulled me out to join her on the dance floor. In my mind, awkwardly moving to the music, and to my slight surprise, there was no spotlight that shone down on me to point out my failure. Encouragement, a few cheers, and a couple of iPhones recording the moment, not to mock or demean, but to celebrate and affirm. As I was with Evan's mom and everyone around me, one of my favorite children's books that we read to our kids came to mind. The book is called Giraffes Can't Dance and is the story of Harold the giraffe and his self-consciousness about his inability to dance compared to his animal friends. Near the end of the book, though, after a cricket, Gerald some encouragement to give dancing a chance, Gerald follows the cricket's advice, and he's ecstatic with the results. Gerald felt so wonderful. His mouth was open wide. I am dancing. Yes, I am dancing. I am dancing, Gerald cried. I felt the same way. If I were judged simply by my dance skills compared to those around me, of course, I would have rated a C- at best. But that wasn't the point. I was out there. I was unafraid of making a misstep. It came to mind for me as I reflected on the process of moving into a situation where there's a good chance for failure, especially if you're still licking your wounds from previous years. Evan's mom was like God for me that evening, reaching out to me, insisting that I come out and join the party. And when she held my hands on the dance floor, she was silently affirming that I would not be alone in the midst of the music and uneasiness. And that's the offer that God makes for each of us. It sucks to fail. We have to name that. We cannot glibly spout off phrases such as failure makes you without acknowledging how difficult it is to come back from failure. But we also cannot be paralyzed by the feeling that failure is final. Here's the thing about those low moments and failures that I have experienced in my ministry. God still did great things. God still used us to do vital ministry. God still took what we offered and enabled us to have an impact on broken lives. This good news and blessed assurance compels all of us to be curious about our own feelings about failure, to name them and know that others experience their own doubts and insecurities, and then watch closely God's lovingly insistent invitation that we go back out to face and dance to the music again. So thank you for your patience as I read that excerpt. But I want to say from the bottom of my heart how unbelievably grateful I am for each of you in your own ministries. I was deeply formed by the campus ministry I had at my alma mater at Simpson College. I'm grateful for the connections that my daughter makes. It's been huge as part of who we are at Urban Village. But I also know just what a turnaround all of you have, the constant revolving door of students that you have, and how there are times when you try things and nobody shows up, and the number of students who ghost on you and who flake on you, and yet you continue to show up. Thank you. Each and every one of you is. And so I hope that, especially in this very, very different fall, as you come back, try to experiment and think about what are we going to do to try to connect with students, that you will be gracious with yourselves, you will continue to try those new things, to learn from the things that don't work out, but just know of your belovedness and know how much you are appreciated by all of us out in the ministry field. So thank you for your patience. I know it's a tough hour to kind of stay connected and to pay attention, but I'm grateful for that and for all that you've shared with us here today. I don't know if there were other, I saw lots of people who were sharing failures, and so I'm really grateful for that.
Christian, one other question that they had, how do you set up fail goals?
I think probably one of the things to do is to think about your the school year in your case, and maybe think about things that you in the past. And on the one hand, and you may have to totally review those again to see which of those things are going to work and not work. And then I would just think about going back to that thinking different, thinking what's something totally new that we're going to try this year. And then you might start small, and because the thought is scary. And so just tell your leaders, this year we're going to try something that because we're going to try different things this year, something is not going to work. And so what would it look like for us to try something that is not going to work at least once? And so I don't think there's a scientific method to it, but I think by like with the Engineers Without Borders, and just being public about that too with your leaders, because there's so much, there's just going to be an event this year where nobody shows up. And so take a stab at how many that's going to be for you. And that's going to be different for everybody's context. And so if it's going to be like there's going to be at least one time this is going to happen this year, and it may be 5 things. And if you quote unquote break that goal, I think that's okay too. But just kind of experiment. And this is going to be a huge school year of experimentation for all of you, I know. And so I guess that would be, and again, for those of you who boards or with Wesley Foundation boards or what have you, find a way to communicate to them too, so that they can, again, it depends on how much pressure all of you might be under, but that might be something to convey to them as well.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Christian, this has been such a helpful talk. I know that all of us have experienced immense amounts of failure this last year as we have tried many, many things. And in all of my conversations this year, we have all lamented the amount of failure and the amount of frustration. And so I'm so grateful for what you have said to us. I think that it is really helpful to hear that and to know that it's going to come later, and we will continue to fail this year too as we try to figure it out and try to connect with you. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, it's been wonderful. Friends,
Thank you.
I misspoke earlier. Our trivia night begins at 8 East, 7 Central. So go get yourself some dinner, take a break, come back and hang out with us. Thank you again to Christian for your conversation. If you want to share more of throughout the rest of this week, I think we can all enjoy that. As Marty said, this is a great encouragement to all of us. So thank you, friends, for being here today. We will see you at 7 Central for trivia night, and more tomorrow. So thank you, Christian. This has been wonderful. Anything else, Edward, that I forgot?
You got it all.
Oh, good.
All right, friends, we will see you later.